Kia ora, Robert. From my count, you probably started the gallery there on Left Bank on Cuba, about 10 years ago? Would that be right?
Yes, it's been 10 years in April just gone, so yeah.
Oh, congratulations. 10 years in lockdown.
Yeah.
What led you to start the gallery in the first place?
I've been working in the gallery world for probably close to 8 years, and at which point I was kind of felt like the right time to step out and open a gallery of my own. So it was kind of a very natural process, really.
The move to set up a gallery in Wellington, was that sort of for personal reasons, or was there actually was it a good business reason in terms of the artists you wanted to represent?
It was a bit of both, really. I mean, we just had my eldest daughter was 6 months old, and we were looking around Auckland as, fairly young people, the pricing, the housing market at the time. And also there was, in terms of the gallery landscape, Auckland at that point was very full and less so in Wellington. So it kind of seemed like the right place to open. And I'd also studied in Wellington as a student, and always I'd very much liked the city and the university. So I originally moved from Wellington to Auckland somewhat reluctantly, so I was more than happy to return.
Yeah. And I guess one of the nice things that I recall from the gallery starting was that you were introducing a whole lot of artists to Wellington, a lot of them pretty much recent art school grads who were doing really fresh and interesting work, who we weren't seeing in Wellington. Yes,
it was kind of fortunate in that regard. Looking back, the timing was particularly good. I mean, some of the first artists I exhibited, the opening show was Patrick Lundberg. He'd never exhibited in a Wellington dealer space, at least. Similarly, John Morton Knox, Richard Frater, Richard Bryant, Sonia Lacey. There was a young group of artists that had maybe been associated with artist runs in Auckland and been in the odd group show in Auckland, but never really had proper solo exhibitions. So it was a particularly good timing, I think.
Yeah, and many of those artists continue to be with you and have had many shows, which is fantastic. At the moment, I think we're looking at images of an exhibition that you've got of artists that tend to get called, outsiders.
So the show in the smaller gallery is a show called Brittle Star, which has been curated by Richard Bryant. This show is a second in a sequence of exhibitions where a gallery artist will be invited to curate a show carte blanche. So last year, Dan Arps was the first to do it. We're just working through alphabetically at this stage. So Richard Bryant's been working towards this show for the better part of a year. And the motivation behind it is very much that the artists can do whatever they want, and I'll just facilitate loans and access to the works. This show, Richard and I share a passion for self-taught work, and this show in a sense has its source in a trip we both did to Mona in Tasmania a couple of years ago to see a touring show from a large self-taught collection based in the UK called the Museum of Everything. And It was a very significant show of self-taught work by most of the kind of people within the canon. And that was the first time where we got to see a lot of the work in the flesh and really get a sense of what it's about. Including in that show works by James Castle and Melvin Way. So the show in the gallery here is a three-person show of Melvin Way, Te Kahurangi King, a New Zealand-based self-taught artist, and James Castle. And Castle and Way are both strong favourites of Richard. And the rough kind of unifying theme of the show is text symbols, pictographic elements within the work of the three artists.
Now, the spaces we're looking at, Robert, you shifted in the left bank from a smaller space downstairs to upstairs. You've now got two spaces.
Yeah.
I was quite interested in your decision on expanding the gallery and being able to hold more exhibitions, because I know for you as a dealer, your work is not just about showing work. You're looking after artists, and it's not all just about exhibition.
Well, it was really a frustration with not being able to have enough shows, because I mean, by the time, the single space, by the time you've kind of mapped out a year, you're looking at maybe 10 shows 10 shows odd. And as a gallery grew and, I started representing more artists, for a lot of artists to be showing ideally would be showing every 18 months or something like that. And that just wasn't going to be possible in a single gallery space. So that was part of it, plus also just a larger scale space to be able to show larger works and to kind of enable artists to work with a larger space and kind of step up into that space. You can kind of be self-limiting as a gallery if artists can't take on a bigger space than they might be used to. You might not. It can help develop the practice.
One of the things I was thinking about in terms of your practice, I guess, as a dealer is that there's a certain sensibility about some of your artists that feels, in a sense, common, and it may be about your interests, so sort of a sensitivity to material, a delicacy of even in the way that people look at thought and the complexion of thought. I mean, how do you see your own style or aesthetic?
I'd say it's still emerging. I mean, I think if something is genuinely going to be a reflection of your taste, then you're probably not going to be that aware of it, if that makes sense. I think it's like, I'm generally quite intuitive in terms of like the artists that I work with and who I gravitate towards. I do think it's important to try and have a sense of diversity within the artists in the gallery, because I think it serves all artists well in terms of broadening the audience and not narrowing things down too much. I'm very interested in similarities across difference, and particularly across, say, formal or superficial differences. And one of the recent things within the gallery of the last few years is, such as the current show, is this kind of combination of different styles immediately next to one another. So the current show of Richard Frater next to Brittle Star, I mean, you kind of combining a very contemporary art language in the work of Richard Frater to completely self-taught vocabulary next door, and I think the interrelations are very illuminating. At a similar timing last year, we had the Dan Arp solo show in the large gallery with the Frank Walter show next door, an Antiguan self-taught artist. And I think it's those kind of similarities that might not be immediately apparent. That's what I'm particularly interested in, I think.
Yeah, and finally, Robert, what interested you about Richard Frater's work?
I first started working with Richard Frater back in 2011. Richard's very agile artist. At the time, he was making films. He'd made some series of carpet works. There was a kind of real material curiosity and a kind of conceptual curiosity as well. So this is our fifth solo show together at the moment, and he's just a very curious artist. I mean, all the shows have been very different, and there's a lot of kind of condensed thought within the work, which I think is very interesting.
Richard, let's start by me just asking, I mean, when did you and Robert start working together?
I started working with Robert after my year of my master's study in Glasgow. I think I reached out to him because he was representing a couple of my friends, and I liked the shows that he was doing. So, and he basically showed my first body of work after my studies at the Glasgow School of Art.
And you've been based in Berlin for some years now. I think 5 exhibitions at Robert Heel Gallery. What does exhibiting back in New Zealand mean for you?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's like a question that obviously a lot of artists have to answer, and it's been put to me before, and I've had, I think my answers evolved to that question as well. I've always thought, my relationship to the world and the topics that I'm interested in I've always had to have them account be held accountable to where those ideas first formed, which was in New Zealand. So
Right.
I think I think one way to answer it is that at least while I was studying, I was always looking outwards to Europe and the US for kind of cues on what was happening and what was interesting. And then when I got over here, found myself quite asking a lot of questions about what it like to look into New Zealand from afar. And over time, that question's changed as well, because I'll go back and spend time in New Zealand and have a more embodied experience there that will then again challenge my distant perspective. So that's what it means for me.
Well, with this interview, we're looking at some film of your current exhibition here, which is titled What Remains of a Naturalist. I'm wondering if you could introduce the show for us, Richard.
Yeah, there's like different ways to introduce it, but I'll just start with the old art school trick, which is describing what's in the show. And I have 3 photographs of Kia on the rooftop of rental cars, and I have 2 flag works. One is made from an existing flag and has been modified, and one is a making of a design from the 2015-16 flag referendum in New Zealand. And then there's a plot graph, climate plot graph, a visualization that's a ready-made found in newspaper. And the final works, which have been important as well, as these audio works. There's 3 audio works total. And yeah, one of them's a work for voice, and the other 2 are called walk pieces, and they're collaborations with sound artists. So that's kind of like the basic layout of the show. There's personal anecdotes as well that are important to the show, but what I was working with in this exhibition was a series of examples of what I call like didactic simplification. So like models of reducing enormous amounts of information down into very simple signs,
Right.
so that macro perspectives can be communicated on a simple level. Thinking of what it would mean to have some images in the show that have made an impression on me over the last year. So images that I had kind of kept up in my studio for a long time, and tried to understand these simplifications that essentially were kind of contradicting each other because they had very different messages, but all had simple forms.
Can you give us an example, Richard?
I guess if you take the climate plot graph, what that is thousands of pieces of data measuring like annual measurements of temperature recordings in every country in the world over 100 years. So, yeah. But all of that is reduced into 2 colors, blue and red. So you have this kind of beautiful visualization and image of global warming, essentially, a message that can't really be challenged, but at the same time, it's just reduced to 2 colors.
I guess thinking of the visual complexion of charts, you've also got flags in the show, including a flag from Daniel Michael Sattelli there. Maybe you could tell us about that.
It was a flag design that I encountered on Daniel's Facebook page. Yeah, he submitted a design which was titled Ode to Mediocrity. And at the time, I remember it being quite a thought-provoking design, and one that had some humor to it. We talked about it being like starting off as kind of a flippant gesture of sarcasm, and that flag was for the 2015-2016 New Zealand flag referendum, and it was rejected. So when I spoke to Daniel quite recently, I asked him whether we could work on making an actual official version of the flag. Then we proceeded to have a conversation which was about sharing my interpretation and learning where I had got it wrong and where I might have got it right, and him sharing what it meant to him. And we talked about this gesture of the rejection being a moment where the flippant gesture became a moment of, cultural repression. And so, yeah, he agreed to me making this work. And we talked about referencing him in the title. So I called the work Daniel Michael Satale's Rejected Flag Design for the, 2015-2016 New Zealand flag referendum. Because the design itself was quite rough, I just used the New Zealand state ensign as a kind of guide.
Yeah.
Guiding, to sort of answer the questions where I wasn't sure what proportions were correct. So I just used the code, which was quite fun. And then the main thing was that I just asked him whether he would be interested in displaying it back to front, because there are, it's quite an antagonist. There's a degree of antagonism to this work that we wanted to carry through to its new presentation. And he was quite excited by that idea, I think, and I think he still is.
So what does putting it back to front do for it, Richard, in terms of antagonism?
Well, so basically, the way that I worked with a flag designer here, and I asked them to create the black gestures. It's actually a white design, so the flag is predominantly white.
Oh, I see.
And then there's like a black curve. There's not much point describing it because it'd be good for people to go and see it in the show.
Yes.
But the little elements are just for the Southern Cross, and then essentially a bell curve line. There's a few things I was sort of like navigating while I was making these flag works. I imagined, last year all of these fires were happening around the globe. So we have the fires in the Arctic Circle, and there were fires in the Amazon. We have bushfires as well in Australia. And I was in Europe, and I was reading about these fires, and they were often compared to, the largest ones were compared to the scale or area of a country in Europe.
Yes. And
that was, for me, like an example of like sublime statistics or like cautionary comparisons, or, like a real common one is like the Amazon being cleared at like 20 football fields a second or something. I can't remember the exact one, but whatever, all of these, in my opinion, are examples of sublime statistics, and they don't do anything to mobilize human experience. Like I can't relate to these fires. I found that kind of I think that is quite problematic. And it's obviously it has a lot to do with attention and how much information we're consuming today, and need to communicate it really fast. And so what you have is like this quick to punt and kind of quick fix kind of information that we're like addicted to. We're addicted to these forms of communication. So I just was, interested that this was one of the comparisons of the bushfires was compared to the scale of Switzerland, and another one was compared to Denmark. And I started looking at flags online, and I just found a flag that was like a traditional World War II vintage Swiss flag that was actually the incorrect portions of the Belgian maritime flag. And I thought about that being a representation of my failure to actually comprehend like the scale of these fires, So in a way, like when you hear the size of a country, you don't think about the shape of the country. Your mind kind of goes to the flag, and it just by coincidence, the Swiss flag is red, and like of course red is like a sign of danger or alarm or emergencies. Thinking a lot about how politics is driven by emotions today, emotional states, and how emotions are dominating the political landscape at the moment. I wanted to imagine that Swiss flag that work that I made was like a single tiny square in that climate graph. It's not that, I don't think it's that demanding to for the audience to and make that connection. They spend some time with it, but even if they miss it, it would still probably prove my point that people are mainly just having emotional responses to these works. I started to think about how, like, the sort of anticipatory nature of thought, and whether I could think about the future of the work. Like, is a work on a wall just what we're seeing, or do its material conditions also have social conditions, and what will those be in the future? And I think in a commercial show, that relates a lot to like the finance or the sale of the works. I wanted to see whether this form of didactic simplification, like coming to like communicating some very intense data into like a very simple form, intense amount of data, whether there is a way to regenerate some habitat loss from those fires through a work. So that's why it's in the title, why there is this kind of, because I sort of imagine that if the work were to sell, that some of the money could go to actual like habitat rehabilitation. Or
that title, Richard, can you remind me what it is?
Yeah, it's called the habitat recovery of the glossy and red-tailed black cockatoo in Western Victoria and Eastern South Australia. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
So, yeah.
You used that word mobilization before, and this idea of mobilizing people with this idea of, a fire the size of a country, but then also I guess the flag as a form seems to be in there, of how a flag can both mobilize people, but can also, and I guess this is quite relevant to a lot of what we're seeing at the moment, flag almost leads to inaction as well, a sort of a complacency, a sort of staying within boundaries and lines. So this kind of sense of visual language you're playing with.
To me, it's fascinating if actually this flag work does like build some habitat for this. Like this parrot, this cockatoo is a habitat specialist. So when 50% of its habitat was wiped out last year, in 2019, that's ornithologists can look at that and go, okay, we can expect to see half of that population die in the next year, because they rely and they have a symbiotic relationship to a specific tree that is wiped out in those fires, the she oak. So for me, it's like not really the problem isn't really how we're communicating, it's whether we can just keep rebounding like off that, like whether we can go, okay, if we're going to communicate like that, then let's bounce it. Let's push it somewhere else and see whether that work, that material object accepts that new condition.
I mean, the title of the exhibition, What Remains of a Naturalist, I'm interested in your use of the word naturalist, and I've seen particularly your bird photography before, like goshawks copulating, trees felled by storms. I guess I would be right in thinking just trying out a new approach to, thinking about our relationship with nature or our part in nature through photography. That's a particular strand of your work at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, naturalist might be for a lot of people like a dirty word, because when we think about our colonial history and the early naturalists that were part of writing the history of settler culture, it has a fraught and troubling relationship that were to early New Zealand history. I wasn't using it for that reason. I was interested in a way of being in the world that is shrinking with biodiversity. So I was thinking about a cultural form of being in the world, which is essentially empirical, that's shrinking with the loss of biodiversity. The naturalist coming out of like the remains of nature. So we're kind of like in an after nature stage now. And I think this is pretty acceptable in a lot of disciplines. For example, although in academia, sustainability is still a key word that is widely disseminated. A lot of areas of study where sustainability is important is shifting to use like regenerative ecology, because like we don't really want to sustain the situation that we're in, and the words we use do have a way of trapping us in kind of situation that we're in. So for, like I thought a lot about how most of the information available to us today about climate change was available with us since the 80s. And so what we're dealing with today is actually a problem of awareness. Like recognition happened in the 80s,
Yeah.
and now we're addicted to awareness today. Like we're not actioning. Like we're in this state of being aware. Awareness is part of our current kind of numbing effect, like our current kind of detachment from responsibility. I know this sounds all real preachy, but I'm just not that interested in talking about using words like nature or anything like that. Whereas a naturalist, I think there's still a function for a naturalist, even in this kind of place of rapid declining biodiversity.
Yeah.
I think that voice is still important. It's just that it needs to be like reprogrammed.
This seems somehow related to the way you're collaborating in this show. You mentioned in the text a question that persevered. When will the artist learn to listen, and what forms that might take?
Yeah, that was a funny one to put in. I guess like I've been thinking about. I was really like touched, I guess, moved by a kind of quote by Brian Eno recently, where he said, I think of surrendering as an active verb, not a passive verb. And what it helped me with was that often when I'm making an artwork, I'm so kind of attentive and so in need of controlling the work that I inject these ideas of like success and dynamism and balance or tension or whatever into what I think is successful work. And like what I loved about that quote, what it really freed me up to think is that maybe actually that's not what we need right now. Like maybe what I need right now. Like what I need right now is to see works fail, and I need a vocabulary of failure, and I need that to be on the wall, not to put my vulnerability on the wall. Like we're all vulnerable. No one needs to see my vulnerability over another. That's if there's one thing that we need to learn today as white people, it's like not about our vulnerability. Like just step back and listen.
Yes.
But I was thinking more about listening as an aesthetic criteria. Like could I create work where when somebody came into the show, what they're actually experiencing is the artist listening to another person and trying to learn from another person. To me, that seemed like a very generous thing to give the viewer, because like so much artists, that are successful today, it's all about getting the communication right, getting it direct, and that feeds back into the brand, of the artist. And that's how an artist is successful today. But if nothing's working, if the system's fucking broken, then like why are we looking at successful artists as like as an example of like what we should be like? It doesn't make sense. I feel like there needs to be more vulnerability and failure and work, and that's what I was looking for. And then I took that to a different step and was like, actually, it needs to go a step further than that. I need to like allow in the opportunities that I'm given space for other voices to be present. So how did that manifest like actually materially with Miriam? Miriam's someone I've collaborated with before, Miriam Stoney's from the UK. We spoke at length about the show and the lead up to the show, and I just shared with her all of my thoughts, and I said to her, look, I'm not really going to have a press release for the show. It's there might be some little text on the actual work, but there's not going to be a full-blown press text. So But what I thought would be cool is if the viewer could experience somebody thinking about the show in real time. So they're kind of confronted by someone else processing the themes of the show. So what you get in this conversation is you get Miriam, who's essentially representing both of us, because my voice isn't present, and her agreements and disagreements are where my chance to kind of communicate the show to somebody is left. It's like left in her hands, and I thought that would be a risky, fun thing to try. And she produced something which I think is quite beautiful